Hi everyone, and I'd really like to welcome you to this panel discussion on using open sources to build the first database of hate in Australia, a pilot test run. So my name's Deborah Smith and I'll be facilitating this panel. I'll briefly introduce you to the panel participants before asking each one of them to respond to some discussion points. While this is happening, I really encourage you and invite you to engage with the panel by typing questions into the Q&A box, not into the chat, but the Q&A box, which I will then put to the panel after each one has had a chance to speak. So our panel today consists of Dr. Matteo Vergani, Dr. Imogen Richards, Professor Greg Barton, Alexandra Lee, Hayley Tran, and Dan Goodhardt, all from the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. So panelists, so we have time to incorporate the Q&A from the audience, can I ask you to be brief in your responses and to limit your answers to around 3 or 4 minutes? So to get us going, I might put my first question to Matteo. Matteo, if you can take yourself off mute. So can I just ask you, could you tell us a little bit about what this database of hate is proposing to do and what's unique or new about it?
Thank you, Deb. Yes, we propose to collect open source data about incidents motivated by or displaying evidence of, which are two slightly different things, prejudice, including criminal incidents, so violence against people, property damage, non-criminal incidents. This changes depending on the jurisdiction, but let's say offensive gestures or verbal abuse, and hate speech, which again, depending on the jurisdiction, can be either criminal or non-criminal, and can be like offensive or violence inciting social media posts, for example. These and incidents motivated by a hateful extremist ideology. In particular, we are interested in terrorism-related offenses, such as attacks, plots, financial schemes, control orders. So, as John said in his presentation this morning, we really need to disaggregate the different kinds of people who do different kinds of things. And this is exactly what we want to do. So I will let others explain more how we conceptually define hate and hateful extremism. But let me say that all these behaviors that we wanted to capture have something in common. They seek to terrorize and intimidate a broader audience than beyond the victim, and they legitimize violence via mechanisms that are very well studied, like, dehumanization and so on. So how do we propose to structure the database? Well, we want to build a relational database, which means sources are coded across several units of analysis: incidents, offenders, groups, victims, legislation. And each unit of analysis will be coded using different code books developed on the basis of very similar databases like Pyrus or the extremist crime database. And we are going to use open sources, court documents, news media, and so on. In the last 6 months, we have been piloting ideas. We gained significant knowledge, and this is what we are going to discuss today, knowledge about how to create this database that we are doing. Very briefly, what's going to be new? What are we going to tell that we don't know already? Well, we know that relationships between all these hate behaviors exist, like hate crime and terrorism. But we also know that they are understudied and they're not explained by simplistic causal arrows. They can happen at different times in different places differently. So we need to build systematic and comparative and cumulative knowledge about these to promote let's say, comparative research. And we really need to put all the behaviors with the same conceptual measurement behind the structure, the measurement of the behavior within the same database. So we can, and this is the first step to, let's say, address the key limitation of most studies in this area, which is being based on a very limited data set. We'll stop here.
Fascinating, Matteo. Thanks for that really complete answer. Greg, if I can just move on to you there. Can you talk to us about why a focus on hate and hateful extremism may have the potential to be a more useful framework than a narrower focus on violent extremism?
Hi, Deb. Look, thanks for that question. It's hard to give a short answer, but I'll try. Basically, we're interested in hate incidents and incitement of hatred, but specifically, particularly interested in hateful extremism. So we're seeing hateful extremism as sitting alongside and intersecting with violent extremism. We're not saying that all hate leads to violence. We use the word hateful extremism to suggest that it's a more complete system of thought than just an individual being angry with their neighbor, just individual racism, bigotry, misogyny, etc. Although those things intersect as well, obviously. So thinking about it in a more systemic fashion, our proposition is that if we understand why people are engaged in othering, in sort of demonizing of an outgroup, we can better understand how a system of thought and a social network forms around that. So sometimes this leads directly to groups that occasionally engage in violence. So white supremacist groups, far-right groups, but also, in many ways, Salafi jihadi groups in the same way. There's always a demonized other. Invariably, women are in the frame. Very often in Western democracies, there's bigotry and prejudice towards migrants, Jews historically, and through to this present. It's an ongoing problem with anti-Semitism, but also Muslims, people who are non-white, who present as being non-white, indigenous peoples. I mean, that story is very familiar. We're trying to better map the incidents of hate, whether they could be classed as criminal or not, because that's a difficult threshold, to try and get a sense of whether things are getting better or worse, and in what geographic areas and in what issues things are getting better or worse. So we have a better understanding, a sort of a heat map of what's going on. But at the bottom of this is this thesis that hateful extremism overlaps with violent extremism, or at least shares many characteristics. And going back to that conversation with Qasim Qassam and J.M. Berger, and you remember J.M. Berger arriving in his PhD work at this thesis that it's conflict between in-groups and out-groups that sort of defines the existential understanding of an extremist group. I think that's a really helpful way. And in conclusion, let me explain that I was prompted to think about this when I heard David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister in New York at a CVE summit, saying, we need to deal with violent extremism before it becomes violent. We need to deal with extremism. But of course, the recent history under Tory governments of prevent and channel is a train wreck of not being able to define that line where you deal with extremism before it becomes violent. And unfairly, the burden falls upon Muslim communities who are stigmatized. Nevertheless, there's an inherent logic in trying to deal with violence before you get violence. Where do you find that line? Where can the state reasonably pay attention and intervene? It's when groups are expressing hate or inciting hatred. And I think that's a really productive line to engage with, because I think we can reasonably define that, although as Matteo will say, it's not so easy to define, but it's something we haven't researched enough, we don't understand enough, and therefore it's sort of hiding in plain sight.
Good job under tough conditions, Greg, to get all that into a small, succinct answer. Imogen, if I could pose the next question to you, and the question's kind of in two parts. Firstly, I wondered if you could talk us through a little bit about what assumptions you think people hold in relation to personal versus public forms of violence. And then as a part two of that question, what could the database of hate tell us about the relationship between far-right activism and politically motivated hate behaviour?
Thanks for the question. So we're hoping that the database will be able to demonstrate some types of relationships between these different sort of hate-motivated behaviours, if we want to encapsulate it that way, that are sometimes overlooked. So sometimes, for instance, the contagion effect that's been spoken about, wherein one type of violence might be seen to lead to another, or where there are other types of sort of associational connections between different types of behaviours. So in this sense, we're, I suppose, interested in addressing this research question of, again, what precedes more public types of violence and expressions of violence. And in the matter of, I suppose, hateful groups like far right or white supremacist groups differently in different settings sometimes, but what behaviours are they engaged in that might not necessarily just be a part of or an expression of their belonging to a certain organisation or group, but that might actually evidence their wider social impacts, both in public and private domains. So maybe just to illustrate, I think, some of this aspect of the method, which can shed light on these connections. I'm just going to show a couple of slides as well, sort of illustrating how we came to find some of this information, if I can. Okay. Right. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. All good. Okay, so thanks. All right, so building on other aspects of the method, again, I'll go through it quite quickly, but that Hayley might perhaps speak about, or others in the panel. One aspect entailed searching the Australian legal database OSPLE and the news databases FactAvert and Newsbank for documents pertaining to legal or interactions with the individual's interaction with the legal system that also mention far right or extreme right groups. So on this slide, you'll see a network analysis sort of map, preliminary. So to be listed on this map, the network or the organisation needed to have a local leadership structure and its members needed to have made efforts to recruit Australians and so you can see the different colours denoting the different radical, far or extreme right denotations that we attributed, and this framework was derived from Cass Mood's Far Right Today, his 2019 sort of conceptual work, and Mondon and Winter's definition of the far right. I might not go into that now, but importantly, the lines or links represented shared members, either where the groups had a shared membership or concurrently or consecutively. And importantly, this isn't done for drawing false equivalence. Obviously, some of these groups only have, a very limited membership that have been part of white supremacist groups. But the extreme right denotation particularly referred to the revolutionary violence, propensity toward revolutionary violence, where far right sits in between that more mainstream and more extreme. So won't spend more time going through that. But after we looked through these, this is some preliminary coding. You can see some of the cases that were turned up. We had 57 searching for extreme and far right groups that we found. And if they didn't turn up, no cases were apparent in OSPLE, and we're going to repeat this process through other legal databases as well. Then we went to FactAvert or Newsbank to look for other cases that might show up. So just to show you some, again, very 2 minutes, preliminary trends. We've just got some of these listed up the top, but some of these, I guess, examples of this contagion effect or different associational relationships between different types of prejudice include some of these cases that I've just highlighted here. And we had some research assistance with this as well. And we're also looking at going to the courts as well in order to access documents that aren't just immediately available via the databases to get a more comprehensive sample. But just to point out some of these, this contagion effect, or at least associational relationship, is evidenced by, for example, the revoking of a man's firearms license after a domestic violence incident and subsequent mental health assessment. So eventually the license was was only temporarily revoked, given that the judge or the tribunal member ruled that found in his sentencing that to remove it permanently would be a slippery slope to totalitarianism. But that person is very active, has been very active in white supremacist blogs like the White Pride Coalition of Australia. So you can have a look for yourself, the other examples there. One I think that's particularly interesting, another one is this longer description. So that was a man charged with using Signal as a carriage service to send videos of the Christchurch attack. And his defence was that it was unlikely to cause offence because his audience were white supremacists. So he's also fairly well known, and his business has been a financial sponsor of the Daily Stormer. And he also actually has videos still up on Vimeo and elsewhere, where he markets a caltrop device which would fall from your car in a high-speed chase and flatten the tyres of people following you. And he's marketed that as useful for fleeing the scene of a hate crime. So obviously there's different types of behaviours or activities that might demonstrate propensity or likelihood to engage in public violence, but that also have these, private sort of hate-based prejudice aspects. And yeah, I might finish there. Okay.
Thanks, Imogen. Fascinating. Alex, could I move on to you? Alex, hate is a pretty complex idea. So what are some of the challenges involved in defining a hate incident?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, like one of the main difficulties is that hate isn't a clear-cut category. It overlaps with discrimination, with abuse, and ultimately power. And as we've been working through some of the individual incidents, these tensions have really started to come out. So one of the challenges of working with set of legal documents on OSLI is that, because it's so difficult to define hate, often, these documents, the judge simply hasn't identified anything as hateful in many cases. Words such as hateful, prejudice, racism, homophobia are used very inconsistently, and sexism is used hardly at all, despite being quite relevant to a lot of cases. So as a result of this, our search strategy actually had to be based on anti-discrimination legislation rather than keywords. So these searches brought up a really wide array of cases related to workplace disputes, terrorism, verbal, physical, and online abuse, sexual harassment, family violence, and abuse against people with disabilities. So as you can tell, it's a pretty long list. And those last few types particularly have been important in shaping our working definition of a hate incident because of the challenges that they pose. So one example, there was a professional misconduct case where a male worker at a mental health facility sexually harassed and assaulted 3 female patients. So I think initially it seems pretty clear-cut. The fact that he's a mental health professional in charge of vulnerable patients seems like there's something sort of obvious about that. But then if we think about it more, does that mean that the same actions would be seen differently if the perpetrator was a family member or another patient? Secondly, it seems obvious that he's targeting women on the basis of their gender and impairment because there are 3 victims in the same position. But then what are the implications for other cases? So does this mean that incidents should be dismissed if there's only 1 victim? I mean, that doesn't seem right. How can we tell basically that he's targeting people on the basis of certain attributes or not? And this is really one of the main challenges that we're currently grappling with. Ultimately, I guess one of the realizations this has led us to is that actions only make up so much of a hate incident. Other parts have to be constituted by contextual factors such as power imbalances and relationships between the perpetrator and the victim. And of course, when it comes to that relationship, perhaps the biggest question is about incidents in the private sphere. Can family violence be considered a hate crime? What about abuse with people with disabilities or older people even? These sorts of events that happen in the private sphere. And I think as most you're all probably aware, this is kind of a discussion that's been happening. And I think someone else maybe might have mentioned it earlier, you know, whether this hate that's involved in private interpersonal relationships is different to the more systemic or group-based hate that tends to be associated with hate crimes. And I mean, that question, I don't know if anyone will ever be able to answer it definitively, but I guess some of the things that we're thinking about, or some smaller questions around that, are we've encountered several instances of judges actually likening family violence to terrorism. So that's very interesting in terms of the climate of fear that's sort of involved. Something else is, if we were to think about, say, misogyny as a hate crime, well, how would we go about specifying specific incidents? So one clear indicator would be, say, the presence of misogynistic language in the incident. But, you know, that comes with a lot of challenges, given that the way language works means that most slurs are gendered or sexualized anyway. So the use of gendered insults doesn't necessarily signal misogynistic hate. Or if we were to believe that it does, then we'd end up with an unmanageable number of incidents. Secondly, you know, another thing that could work would be clear references to gender, sex, or sexism during the case. And that can work well in some cases where it's been brought up. But I think a lot of other times these gender dynamics are more indirectly sort of implied. So yeah, those are some of the main kind of questions that we're grappling with at the moment. And particularly at the early stage of this project, I suppose, we've found it sort of important to attend to each incident on a case-by-case basis so that we can work on really critically examining and expanding the list of hate indicators as we go on.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for that really full response. Hayley, I think Alex's response brings up a couple of things. So if I could move to you with the next question and carry on from some of that. In trying to understand what is considered hate speech or hate behaviour, can this sort of careless or offhanded speech or behaviour be interpreted as hateful? And if I can just add another part to that question, when working with hateful data, what are some of the sort of reflexive practices that your team find helpful in order to find some sort of coding reliability?
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, I thought it would be helpful to share some of the insights and challenges to the more practical side, also of what we're doing, and the challenges that we've been faced with, in particular to screening and coding our data, especially in this pilot phase when looking at court documents. So typically when we're trying to determine whether a particular incident is motivated by prejudice or hate, there are times it can be more intentional and obvious, as Alex mentioned previously about, you know, exerting power and stuff like that. But in some situations, if not a lot of the situations, it's not obvious whether certain speech or behavior is actually motivated by hate. And one of the ongoing themes, I guess, we've noticed is whether carelessness can be perceived as also being hateful. Just because someone is careless about something doesn't necessarily make them, or doesn't mean that they have a hateful sentiment about the thing. But I thought it might be helpful to share two case studies where something that could start off as being careless, I suppose, could potentially be perceived as being prejudiced and hateful, and even in the second case resulted in what I'd call a disaster of structural violence. So the first case is a woman in her 30s who worked, I should say, at a water company that has multiple sites and is quite male dominated, this work industry. So on this particular day, she took through an intern for training on his first day at one of the sites. And the intern had pointed out to the woman that there was a poster of her posted up near the men's toilets. And this poster showed a photograph of her standing with one arm raised. So it's a photograph of her. So it's not even like an illustration or something. It's a photograph of her with one arm raised, and the text that accompanied the photograph said, "Feel great, lubricate, exclamation." Yes, so your reaction, understandably, she was quite similar. So at the bottom of the poster, it was also accompanied by two company logos. One was the water company logo, and the other one was a sort of a collaborative program for work safe spinal cord type programs. And, for some context for people, in medical terms, lubricate in the context I think that they perhaps thought they meant is through joint and physical movement exercises. Synovial fluids in joints and bones are lubricated and therefore keep us from injuring ourselves, etc. But understandably, in a general population context, this victim perceived this to be sexually offensive, and it caused her a lot of embarrassment, and she was mortified. And, even without her consent, the company had used this poster and used her photograph in the poster. And apparently this was due to the second person in the design production team not really paying attention and carelessly approving the printing of the poster and displaying it all around like the different sites of the company. And so in this case, would you say this incident is motivated by prejudice or hate? So the second case study I'd also like to share with you is about structural violence. So this particular case started in 2004 and it went on for a long time, over about 10 years or so, where two policemen I'm just trying to read this. Yes. So 2004, two policemen in the police service in a particular state in Australia, they arrested an Indigenous man who was drunk, and they put him in a van, took him back to the police station, and through the struggling of bringing him in, apparently he fell over, but on the footage of the camera, this man's body was completely limp when the two policemen dragged his body into the cell. So an hour later, he was declared deceased, and the community was completely outraged by this and demanded for something to be done, by this, with the two policemen who were careless. Nothing was acknowledged by the police, and this then resulted in people in the Indigenous community, obviously, instead of de-escalating things, it was more escalated, and they set the police station on fire. So this then resulted in the state being declared as a state of emergency, where the police employed special forces wearing masks and carrying weapons, breaking into people's homes and terrorizing the community even more. So in this case, depending on the society and the culture you live in, law enforcement is usually seen as having a duty of care towards the people and the community. And the lack of this care in this situation was perceived as being very hateful. And so these questions that we ask ourselves in the process of discussing them within our team, you can see very important, not just in the process of screening for incidences, but also how we choose to code them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Hayley. And Dan, in the couple of minutes that we've got left, firstly, can I just encourage people in our audience to pop questions in the Q&A that you'd like me to put to the panel? And Dan, while people start thinking about their questions, could I just put one final question to you, which is around drawing on your experiences working both at Victoria Police and at a community organisation. How can hate incidents be used operationally across different contexts?
Great, thanks, Deb. So yeah, as you've mentioned, I previously worked at a not-for-profit which focused on monitoring anti-Semitism. So most of my experience comes from there, although now I work as a casual researcher at Deakin, and I also work at Victoria Police, albeit not in the area of prejudice motivated crime directly. I think sort of drawing on sort of seeing hate incidents from all of those different angles, one of the things that sort of strikes me is that we've mentioned already that there are some incidents which are reported in different mechanisms, for example, within a community, which don't necessarily reach the threshold for being considered a crime. And therefore, there's a whole variety of reasons why they may not actually ever be reported to the police in a formal sense. And even when they are reported, it's not necessarily going to be treated in the way that the victim is sort of looking for in those instances, because if it's not a crime, it's going to be difficult for the police to do much more than just sort of take a report of that. So I think that the community aspect here is quite important in terms of both collecting some of that data, and what we're looking to do in this project is to bring some of that community data and community reporting into the database so that it can then be shared with other partners such as Victoria Police and other agencies that might be able to benefit from that. I think sort of just looking at this from a bit of a different perspective, as a community, certainly it was my experience that collecting this data is very important for a number of reasons I'll just touch on really quickly. Firstly, I think it's important for the community leadership to have an understanding of how community members are being affected by hate incidents, so that the community leadership can actually offer some reassurance and response to those incidents that are occurring. I think that it also helps the community to then build a relationship with the police whereby they can pass on some really important and useful information. Because as I've mentioned, sometimes community members feel more comfortable reporting to a person within their community, even though they are quite happy for that to then be on-reported to police as well. I think that also some communities, and this was my experience in the Jewish community, have some resources to be able to actually deal with some of these elements directly. So for example, the data that you might get from the incident reporting might help you in terms of the way that you deploy security personnel. It might help you with regards to the procedures and way that those personnel are positioned so that they're able to actually respond in the most effective way. It might help you to provide advice to community members in terms of how they can best protect themselves, and I guess also feel empowered when they are reporting those incidents. And then lastly, I think it can also be very helpful because as a community, there are often opportunities to provide for, to apply rather for different grants and other government support, and having actual details about the incidents that have occurred in your community and leveraging that in the application process can be very effective in terms of sort of getting that support to then get physical security grants and things of that nature. Also, even when community leadership are interacting with other political leaders and figures, it's really good to be able to provide actual examples rather than just sort of theoretical ones. So I think that these are some of the uses of this data for the community side, but I think also VicPol and other government agencies are really going to be able to benefit from this data being centralized in this way as well.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that really interesting insight into the various hats that you wear in your day-to-day life. I might just put a question to the panel as a whole, and whoever feels like they would want to run with this to jump in. But to play devil's advocate, do you think that framing forms of violence as hate might flatten out some of the sort of complex and underlying drivers of violent extremism, or the various roles that people may incorporate into their extremist political behaviour, because not all people, of course, commit violence? So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. Maybe should we start with you, Greg? You're off mute.
Sure. Look, it's a really good question, Deb, and obviously we need to be really cautious about thinking we've got some simple way of solving a really complex problem. I mean, we've talked about hate in a variety of ways in this panel. We have a particular interest in violent extremism and hateful extremism, but a lot of the hate we're talking about is incidental. Some of it's not even necessarily intentional, but the impact on victims nevertheless is very severe. We see this from, from our sporting codes, from football in particular, where racist slurs cause immense damage. We're working on the hypothesis, we're doing several things, but from my personal perspective, working on the hypothesis that organized systemic extremism involves a demonizing of an outgroup that involves quintessentially an element of hate. But not everyone, of course, who gets involved in what we might call violent extremism is strongly motivated by ideas. Sometimes it's a social thing. They go along with a group, they're caught up, with friends. But in amongst that mix, whatever the ideological component, whether it's religious or of some sort of more explicitly political form, there is this notion that a outgroup is bad, is subhuman, is deserving of punishment, is impure, and tied up with that is hate. Now, I acknowledge that hate is complex, and we're struggling ourselves to know how to operationally define it. And you're right, we need to be careful that we don't sort of flatten out things by simply blithely applying a label. If we had a magic data machine, we'd set the dials so it would determine just where we had hateful extremism, just like other magic machines tell us where there's explosive materials or poison or something else, or how radicalized somebody is. But we know that these magical data machines don't work. So we've got to go on the basis of what data we can get. And we do need an empirical basis for this. So we're thinking if we could just systematically collect reports of hate incidents, and whether from the victim's perspective or from a more elevated policing perspective, at least we would have at the beginnings of some data set that would help us understand what's going on. But we mustn't stop and think that explains everything and that everything is all the same just because it has the same label.
Yeah, I can see that Matteo's popped his hand up there wanting to jump in and have something to say about this.
Yeah, just super quickly, Deb. I think two quick responses. So one, I don't think that it's a binary situation, like either there is hate or there is not. And I don't think that the presence of hate erases from the table other factors which might play a role, like strategic or political consideration. And this is the reason why in our database we look at degrees of motivation, degrees of hate, which can be assessed by using a list of bias indicators, which are community specific, and we are working on them as we speak. And the second thing is that regardless of whether specific for terrorism, because I think your question alludes to terrorism specifically, regardless of whether and how much hate plays a role in a specific terrorist incident, look, I would say that it's an empirical question, but my hypothesis would be that 99% of the times it triggers hate. So from what we know from existing research, terrorist attacks trigger waves of hate crimes. We have seen these after 9/11, after the London bombings, and so on, waves of hate speech and so forth. So it's really everything interconnected, as in an ecosystem, as to take Julian's metaphor from this morning.
Thanks, Matteo. I think we have time for one question to do the rounds. One more question, which is, what lessons can be learned from overseas hate data sets? And what difference could you expect to find in the Australian context? Who would like to have a go with that one from the panel?
Can I ask which hate data sets? Because I'm not sure if I know any.
It has not been specifically mentioned. So I'm assuming certain other countries collect information on hate?
Not in the way we're looking at, if at least as far as I know, maybe my colleagues know of some other examples. I know of databases of extremism, terrorism, the extremist crime database, but nothing similar to what we're doing.
I think I can just quickly add, I think maybe what we're talking about is what, role does a database that occupies that space between the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and Hope Not Hate type of qualitative, in-depth studies and analyses of politically motivated hate, again, against outgroups with protected, I was going to add to the last, or thinking as well, could add to the last question, protected characteristics. So focusing on that type of hate, as well as in between, that and Pyrus and other sort of terrorism and extremism related sites that you mentioned earlier, Matteo. So that's kind of how I would imagine this being in somewhat, challenging, but as we've said, without conflating different phenomena, but a more novel contribution in the context of Australia as well. And maybe that reflects something of the blurred lines between those phenomena in Australia, given, I guess, the absence of prescribed groups here and various other structural factors. Maybe it relates to that.
I think it might be worth adding as well that we've been working with the True Vision database in the UK. And so the person who runs that, Paul Genasi, actually was a keynote speaker at an event that we ran last month, where he spoke a little bit about using his sort of 30 plus years police experience, how in the UK there's a public facing website where people can go and submit incidents of hate through that website, and how that is then fed into the police force in the UK, and they can use some of that data in some similar ways to sort of what we're proposing. So certainly that's a really good model that has a lot of pluses that we're actively considering here for certainly the Victorian context initially. And I think that's a good sort of learning in terms of the structure of the database and how to actually get some of the community partners that I've previously mentioned involved in sharing data to then be able to centralize it and provide it to the agencies that need it.
Thanks. Does any of the other panel want to jump in on that?
Just really quickly, Deb. We hope that this is the beginning of something, much bigger than what our group is doing, but that we start around the world to pay more attention to recognizing and documenting hate and getting a better sort of heat map of where it's going on. If you think, to use an analogy, it wasn't that many, well, for, depending how old we are, it wasn't that long ago when people didn't put a price on a forest except in terms of logs. And now we understand that, you need to recognize the value of things when they're left intact and whole. That's now sort of standard reasoning. The Institute of Economics and Peace has taken that econometrics approach to looking at peace and conflict. So the Global Terrorism Index and the Peace Index and other things they come up with reflect that. Now they're working on environmental index. That suggests the value of being able to pay attention to data you've got and collate it well and understand the patterns. So we're hoping that we start to see more and more attention paid to hate incidents, and that we'll better understand the nature of hate. I mean, the end result, it sounds a bit twee, but what we all want is a society that's less hateful and kinder. And that's not impossible. There's great variations around the world, and over time, that's a reasonable thing to aim towards. And it's a bigger picture than just looking very narrowly at violent extremism or even hateful extremism. And it's a good basis for working together with communities that steps away from that trap of securitizing problems and saying your community is a problem because it might produce terrorists. Well, that's pretty destructive. This is a more holistic approach. But yeah, it's early days.
Yeah. Can I also just ask, maybe this is one for you, Alex, because when I was listening to the story, the pretty horrible story that you described about the man who repeatedly targeted women with mental disabilities, I wonder, what does how do concepts like opportunistic choice of victim and that sort of complicate some of the sort of ways you have to understand and interpret your data?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. That's a really difficult question. I think, I mean, personally, to me, I find these sorts of issues sort of on the border of hate or abuse really, really fascinating. I think it's the way I think of it first, and we've sort of discussed it a bit in our team, but it is still very subjective, of course, is that, okay, so taking advantage of people with disabilities, say, this has come up in this incident. It also came up in another one where someone was targeting people for scams to get money from them, basically. I guess that was an interesting case because some of the people that she targeted had disabilities and some of them didn't, although some of them were also older people. So it sort of brings up some really interesting questions as to whether you can say she was targeting them based on an attribute or not. But the thing of opportunism does come in. I would very much link it back to systemic factors which say that, you know, some people are seen as being there, that available to be taken opportunity of more so than others. You know, even if you look at other hate incidents that happen in public, you know, there's always some sort of power dynamic. It might be that the perpetrator is physically bigger, they're in a group, or they just are in a position with where they feel perhaps more entitled to the public space than the victim. So I don't know, maybe like what Matteo said, I don't know that it's whether there is hate or there's not hate, but I think it's very much sort of interwoven with systems of power, because it's those systems that mean that certain people are going to be in a position where they can take, take advantage of others, and others will be in a position where they might be prone to being taken advantage of. But yeah, I mean, we do have to draw a line somewhere. It's a good question as to where exactly that is.
Did you want to jump in there, Hayley, and add anything to those questions there? Oh, you're on mute.
I don't have much to add, but you know, that's that opportunistic sort of very complex area for us also crosses over with the misogyny space a lot. You know, we, if not pretty much all misogyny cases that I come by, I have to flag them as, we need to discuss this. Is this person literally just violent? Is it widespread, or is it specifically targeting a history of women? And that's another thing we have to consider. Is there a history of something? And does a history of something also mean that we can more definitively say, oh, this is probably motivated? But yeah, the misogyny space is probably the next thing we'll have to really tackle with. It's a big space. I guess that's the next bit. Yeah.
Did you want to jump in there, Matteo?
Very quickly to say, it's of course I agree with all my colleagues, and thanks for all the examples. I guess, Deb, you asked a very difficult question to Alex, and in the literature, in criminology, maybe many of you know, there are two distinct ways to identify a hate crime. One is the so-called animus model, which means identifying a clear fact, an indicator of bias, which can be the use of certain words or whatever. The other is the discriminatory selection model, which means if a person from a certain group targets a person from a subordinate group, that is enough to define it as a hate crime. When in both models, there are, you know, opportunities and weaknesses and limits. So I guess we are more towards an animus model in which we incorporate also perceptions of victims and witnesses as a bias indicator. So we are working on that at the moment in our piloting, but I guess we don't have a clear answer as yet. But let's say our piloting means that we are working on establishing a clear code book and a clear list of bias indicators, which we will use to start collecting data in the next months, I guess.
Fascinating. Can I just give the panel any a chance to raise any issues that hasn't been raised yet before we finish and head to a break? If anyone wants to just hasn't had a chance to comment on something as it went around, or I haven't given you that opportunity, please jump in now.
Let me jump in briefly, Deb, if it's okay. Just to clarify one of the applications of what we're doing, and this is, you know, we're doing, when we started thinking about doing this, we wondered why other people weren't doing it before, and now we know, because it's very hard to do properly, but it's still important, as we're still more convinced that it's important. But one aspect, we've been talking a lot about far-right extremism, and we think about far-right extremism as being white supremacist, and in Western democracies, it largely is. But across the world, there are various expressions of toxic identity politics. It might be Burmese nationalism that demonizes the Rohingya. It might be Hindu nationalism that demonizes Muslims or Christians, et cetera, right? It's a big problem. And involved in this is the demonizing of an outgroup. Identity politics is understandable. It's even legitimate and necessary. But when it's hateful, it's a problem. So we think that if we could understand the manifestations and drivers of hate better, then we would be better equipped to try and deal with the problem. And I think that you can get some insight on this with the accounts of former far-right extremists, particularly white supremacists, who've talked about how they've come out the other side. Previously, they hated Jews. They didn't know any Jews, but they just hated them. When they understood the horrors of the Holocaust, they met with families that had suffered. They formed personal friendships, completely flipped over and transformed. It's one element of their journey out of hate. And you know that better than anyone else, the role of emotions and affinity and everything else gets bound up with that. But we just think that paying attention specifically to hate is a key under-researched area we want to focus more on, because it helps us with a whole bunch of things, including hateful and violent extremism.
Terrific. And I noticed, Matteo, you wanted to jump in with something that I hadn't given you the chance to say. So here's your opportunity.
No, thank you, David. I actually wanted to ask if any of my colleagues, because we had a lot of discussions about also including structural violence as part of the database, but we didn't have the opportunity now to speak about it. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to jump in relation to this, because it's a really let's say important issue, especially in the Australian context, we believe, because of the history of colonization and you know, in relation to the indigenous community especially, and this was brought up by the example that Haley discussed. So maybe we're thinking about also including incidents that express structural violence, but again, we are working on the exact parameters as yet. Yeah.
Yes, that would be a very challenging task.
I could add to just briefly, Matteo, if you just asked if there's ideas about that. I think we had mentioned, just very briefly, we had mentioned once before, in a previous seminar discussion, that it might be useful to not only look at what incidents are reported on in news media or are represented in legal documents, interactions with legal systems, but those which are omitted, you know, routine, everyday cases of prejudice. Figuring out some way of accounting for those. So perhaps looking at patterns. We could do, mixed methods kind of analyses of patterns of reportage in relation to certain issues, which itself is indicative of the role that institutions like news media, as with academia, as other presentations have highlighted as well, what's actually emitted from the discourse is and the voices that are routinely marginalised as well, is something that our, I guess, public-facing database would hope to help to address.
And we're never, sorry, Deb.
I'll go. I was just going to ask a logistical question around continuing to gather that data. Do you expect it to go beyond using the resources, the open source court documents and that you are now, to become a sort of live collection, just to make your life more complicated?
We need the magic data machine, which we don't have.
Yes, yes.
What I was going to say is we're in the realm where we fully understand we're never going to get perfect data, and that includes timely data and comprehensive data. And so we're going to struggle with how we draw the parameters. But it's very much the case of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So an incomplete data set that nevertheless is fairly clearly mapped out and has clear parameters is still really, really useful. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So that's our cop out when we can't answer the question, is that some stuff is just going to always be too hard to do, but we can try and figure out what is available, get the low-hanging fruit, and then at least we have something to work with.
Yeah, and I think that all research, no matter what you choose, has limitations, and it's good when you're just thinking those through and aware of them. I think is a sign of a healthy project. So look, I think what we might do is call this to an end. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion from a really, really stellar panel, and great to see and hear some of that really fabulous work that's going in to the hate database. And I think, we look forward to AVERT 2022, where we see where you're up to, guys, because a year from now, I suspect that things will have moved along and a whole lot of issues will have arisen and had to be nutted out. And we really look forward to hearing about that. Before we close, I just want to suggest that everyone take 10 minutes to, it's become sunny here in Melbourne. So if you're in Melbourne, take 10 minutes to get up, maybe go outside, get some fresh air. They're long days here. Stretch. Move your body a little bit, get a glass of water, go to the bathroom and make yourself a cup of tea. And we'd like to see you back here at 2:10 for our next panel. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, panel. Terrific. And we'll see you all soon in 10 minutes.